one of the things that fascinates me about Liz is has a job that she made up. And so as I narrate her biography, I think you want to be listening very carefully about her professional development and transitions because the world of the production of knowledge and culture is changing fast, and that means that career paths and job descriptions are also changing fast. I think this museum studies program is one of those places where people who are really fluid in this way, and will be fluid probably for their whole working lives, tend to gravitate. So I think that it's worth mapping this out in some care and thinking about, all of us thinking about ourselves as improvisers, professional improvisers, from one time to another, not to unnerve you anymore about, about your futures, but I do think that it's a fascinating story, and one relevant to everyone. So Liz's undergraduate studies were at Yale, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude in history in 1994. She went on to get a master's degree with a minor in public history from NYU, and went on to the doctoral program in American history at NYU. Her most recent publication along, I guess, those lines is The Making of Loisaida in Mambo Montage, the Latinization of New York City. She went on to be the Vice President of Interpretation, which I think is a great job title, the Vice President of Interpretation at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City. There she developed internationally recognized programs for all ages that connect the dramatic stories of that neighborhood's immigrants, past and present, along with initiatives to inspire civic dialogue on cultural identity, labor relations, housing, welfare, immigration, and other issues. She also oversaw the education, public programs, and curatorial departments and assisted in the strategic plan. As part of the museum's outreach efforts, she directed 2 ongoing programs, the Immigrant Resource Guide and the Lower East Side Community Preservation Project. And when she was here for the Activating the Past conference, you were talking about the post-9/11 debates around immigration and new citizens that were very fraught in that Lower East Side neighborhood. She's also worked for the Smithsonian Folk Life Festival, the Museum of the City of New York, the Eldridge Street Project, and the American History Workshop. Currently, she's the director of the International Coalition of Historic Sites, Site Museums of Conscience, which describes itself as part of a new movement in culture and human rights, and she'll be talking about that. In this role, she coordinates exchanges among historic sites around the world that develop programs and practices to address contemporary issues in historical perspective. This is coordinated from the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, so she probably goes to the same address most days. And this coalition is a network of how many now? 16 historic sites committed to working together to develop effective strategies for activating places of memory as centers for dialogue on contemporary issues. Their goal is to use the history of the sites, whether it's genocide, a violation of human rights, or a triumph of democracy, as a foundation for discussion about how and where these issues are alive today and what can be done to address them. Directed by Liz Sevcenko, the coalition works collaboratively and offers tools and resources to develop and strengthen sites of conscience worldwide. And you should talk to Liz at the end about ways to stay in touch or find out more about this work. So before I turn it over to Liz, I'm just going to give you a sense of the international breadth of their efforts as the coalition works to build the following networks. And the way that these missions have been crafted regionally, I think, is very striking. So there are 4 clusters: African sites of conscience. And the theme there is using histories of citizen action to develop post-colonial and post-conflict democracies. Asian sites of conscience, promoting cultures of peace and pluralism in the wake of ethnic and religious conflict. Russian sites of conscience, building an anti-totalitarian culture. And South American sites of conscience, promoting debate through the constructions of memory of the recent past. So that's the end of the introduction, and now we're going to go on to the dialogue. And the first question, of course, is how did the coalition come into being?
Well, it was a funny, odd way that it came into being. I said when I came last time that it was kind of a support group for misfit museums. that started as an idea of the Tenement Museum, which found itself just a few years ago kind of stuck between two categories of institutions without any kind of accepted identity of its own. The museum was founded in 1988 to promote tolerance and historical perspective, which is kind of an unusual mission for a museum, dealing with the variety of immigrant and migrant experiences on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And the core of the museum is a 5-story tenement building that was built in 1863, home to more than 7,000 immigrants from over 20 different nations, that's still located in a neighborhood that's over 40% foreign-born, and it was dedicated to telling the stories of immigrants that passed through the building between 1863 and 1935, all the variety of experiences and issues that they dealt with as a way of providing perspective on the current situation in the neighborhood and the many different groups that were still dealing with similar questions of immigration and housing, social welfare, and really creating a space for public dialogue on those issues. So with that mission, we were often asked, well, are you a museum? Is that a museum? Museums, as you know from being a part of museum studies, are often asked to define themselves on their collections. And people often associate museum collections as sort of fine objects, unique objects, and we ran into this issue when we tried to apply for accreditation to the American Associations of Museums, and we had to fill out the sort of what are your collections. And I think they were expecting us to talk about, a certain set of paintings or a certain, period for decorative arts. And we asked for accreditation to be sure that the artifacts that we found in the ceilings, for instance, of the tenement apartments that we were restoring, which included an embalmed or kind of frozen cockroach and a mummified rat, and about 3,000 buttons and a bunch of sewing needles, that they would survive for posterity to really be the starting point for people to think about how did they get here and what they mean and how were they involved in people's lives. Then the other section of the application is about museum education. And our museum education programs included programs that helped young people inspect their own apartments for housing violations and launch protests to the proper authorities. So we actually are accredited now. At the time that when I came last, we were not, but we had to reapply about 4 times. And because it just wasn't making any sense. And we got a letter from one funder at one point in our career saying that, well, it sounds nice, but we don't. It was a museum funder that said, well, we don't fund social service agencies. There must be some confusion why you thought you could apply to us, although the museum is in our name and we're chartered as a museum. So then we thought, well, are we instead a social service agency or an advocacy organization? And turned to sort of that field and those set of institutions. And we got responses like, well, the Tenement Museum does teach English to new immigrants. That's something that is supports the kind of work and priorities that we have. But you spend an inordinate amount of time talking about things that happened 100 years ago. And you spend a lot of resources, preserving your collections, and your site, which it's not clear how that's really of any help to people dealing with issues today. And the other issues came up that some organizations couldn't support a space that fostered open debate on certain issues because we often accepted voices that we personally found objectionable on the subject of immigration to provide other perspectives on some of the positions that we supported. But those were sort of details. I mean, the main thing was just from the front, it was this sense of you're a museum. And museum was a code word for something that was elite and exclusionary and effete and couldn't possibly have anything to do with the real concerns of the neighborhood today. And so basically it was sort of a waste of time. So we really found ourselves feeling that the connections between past and present and between history and civic participation were natural, organic, and just right before our eyes and critical. And this, again, about 5 years ago when we were starting out, there was some support for this, for sure, in the museum field, and the kind of discourse of the museum field. I think it was 2000 or so that the American Association Museums president and CEO Edward Abel talked about, sort of made a big announcement that, quote, "The times demand that museums take their civic responsibility seriously as a core value," and projected a vision of a museum as a center where people gather to meet and converse, a participant in collaborative problem solving, an active, visible player in civic life, and a trusted incubator of change. There are also large funders like the Ford Foundation, who celebrated cultural institutions who are moving to claim an active, intentional role in public dialogue around the kinds of contemporary issues that provoke multiple viewpoints. So these were the kind of statements that would just thrill us and make us feel like, well, this is really more of a mirror onto what we're doing on the ground. But I'm sure anybody who's sort of running an institution or in an institution knows that the kind of statements that get made, or the kind of discourse that happens at that level, doesn't always trickle down into support for your practice on a day-to-day basis. And so we still continued to sort of labor in alone, and found ourselves really having to decide whether to change course or find friends who could support what we were doing on a very practical level on the ground. So we wound up looking for a community and trying to build a community by kind of throwing a message in a bottle off the shores of Manhattan in the form of a fax to it was not a very scientific process, but it was any other institution, any other type of historic site that we had heard about, that had been recommended to us, that we had seen, that we felt might really envision their work in this same way. We described the role we felt we could play and asked if anybody felt the same. And we got 8 responses initially. This was in 1999. With these stories of this extraordinary work that was happening in a huge variety of cultural and political contexts that was really inspiring to us. And they were the District 6 Museum in South Africa, which was interpreting forced removal under apartheid, and I'll talk a lot, I'll give more examples of their work later on. The Gulag Museum in Russia, which was preserving the first Stalinist labor camp, the only Stalinist labor camp to be preserved in the country. The Liberation War Museum, which was excavating killing fields and memorializing the genocide of the Bangladeshi people during the War of 1971. The Maison des Esclaves, or the slave house in Senegal, which was an 18th century kind of slave transport station off the coast of Dakar. A number of sites, interestingly, in the National Park Service, including the Women's Rights National Historical Park, Martin Luther King National Historical Site, Memoria Abierta in Argentina, which commemorated sites associated with the disappeared there. Terezín Memorial in Czech Republic, which was a sort of ghetto labor camp used to model the humane practices of the Nazi regime to the Red Cross. And the Workhouse in England, which preserved a sort of Victorian vision of social welfare, a building that was a place for indigent people to find relief, but a very punitive environment that was used all the way from 1834 through the 1980s, and saw kind of every different expression of Britain's attempt to deal with the problem of poverty and to deal with its class issues. And all of these places were, in very, very different ways, fostering public dialogue on the issues that their sites raised, whether it was building a sort of culture of human rights, getting prosecutions for people who had committed crimes, or raising awareness about social welfare. So we were very heartened, and when we met for the first time, again, this was in 1999, we were amazed, we were meeting each other personally, and we were amazed to learn that very few of us actually came from a museum background, that most of us came from some other type of work, whether it was, we had run human rights campaigns or human rights organizations and felt that this was the natural next step in our work. And that the best contribution that we could make was by activating history, because we recognized it as a really powerful tool. It was also apparent immediately, everybody shared that their work was very difficult. People had different difficulties, but everybody faced some kind of major opposition or exclusion. We were also developing a kind of new path and new models, or a new practice with no models to follow. And for those two reasons, it was immediately clear to us that we needed to band together to form a coalition that would provide us with new tools for doing what we wanted to do, new partners, and new forms of support. So it was at that first meeting that we formed the International Coalition of Historic Site Museums of Conscience. And since then, we've grown to a kind of leadership group of about 16 model sites of conscience in all different continents of the world, who lead a broader network of about 1,000 initiatives from more than 100 different countries. This year, as Julie mentioned, one of our significant achievements is launching these regional networks that are really deepening, creating these kind of constellations of sites that are all dealing with a similar human rights issue and bringing a similar history to deal with a similar human rights issue, and are therefore creating these kind of coordinated conversations, these coordinated efforts to deal with that issue. So that'll be really significant. I look forward to seeing how it develops. So just what the coalition does together, and then I think what we're more interested in is sort of the pedagogy and the ideas, but we work in two main areas. One is advocacy, where we're sort of working to create the political space for sites of conscience to exist and thrive. Sometimes we do this by really directly, acting a little bit like a human rights organization, pressuring governments through media and other kinds of campaigns to allow a certain story to be told. We are dealing right now with one of our sites actually being shut down for its content and just sort of open censorship in Russia. Other times it's trying to encourage human rights and transitional justice efforts like truth commissions and other processes to embrace, to collaborate with sites of conscience and use the kinds of spontaneous memory activities that that citizens are just doing all the time, and kind of harness that energy to create an integrated process of memory and justice, to really use what people are doing for justice efforts. So that's the advocacy piece. We can't advocate for sites of conscience and really promote this idea if we can't point to really successful examples of what this looks like and how it works on the ground. And for that reason, it's equally important or more important for the other side of our work, which is capacity building, where we are supporting specific innovative programs at each of these sites that really demonstrate how memory can be activated for social change. Sponsoring collaborations between sites so they learn from each other, learning exchanges, and just disseminating and developing new methodologies that we can all use and learn from. So those are the two main areas that we're working in, and that's a little bit about the history of the coalition and what we're doing now.
Well, flowing inevitably from that is the question of building on that organic level of experience to the level of definition and theory making out of this work. So can you define a site of conscience and the theory behind that definition?
It was really important for us, especially when you have an international group, to define exactly what we meant by who we were. And our definition was not only to give our work focus, but it was almost like setting a standard, a challenge to all of us for what standard we wanted to meet and what standard we wanted to hold other sites to. So we have very strict criteria for membership that really, as I said, is meant to stand as a challenge for how we would meet our civic obligations. Because I think one important point about the kind of statement that we made when we first came together is that the sort of founding statement begins that we hold in common the belief that it is the obligation of historic sites to engage in programs that stimulate dialogue on social issues and the set of ideas that I'm about to explain. So it's not that we're saying that it's a possibility or a potential of historic sites, but rather it's the obligation of all sites to take on this active role. We define sites of conscience as museums that, 1, interpret history through sites, 2, assist the public in drawing connections between past and present, and engage in programs that stimulate dialogue on pressing social issues, and 3, share opportunities for public involvement in issues raised at the site. So I'll go into each of those in a little more deeply in a minute, but I think the important thing also is that there's nothing inherent in a site that makes it a site of conscience or not a site of conscience. It's not about the fact, it's not restricted to sites that interpret great tragedies. It could be a site that interprets a great triumph of justice. It can be a huge event, it can be a small event, it can be a huge site, it can be a small site. It's really about the responsibility that the stewards of the place take to activate its history and help visitors to use the perspective that it provides to confront the questions that they continue to face. So I'll just take each of those elements of the definition to get into kind of the debates that we had in forming the coalition and what we were thinking, and how these guide our practice. So the first was interpreting history through sight. So in some ways that was just a simple kind of definitional tool to focus our group, just saying that the museums in our network are those that are interpreting a specific historic place, because we saw that there were a lot of specific challenges and particular opportunities in preserving an actual site. So that means that a place like the Holocaust Museum in DC, although they're part of our broader network, is not, it's not interpreting a place. So it's not part of this, it's not part of our definition. We then also discuss what it means to, what does that mean, interpret a historic site or interpret history in a site? Does it just mean a lot of, there are many historic sites out there that just sort of tell you such and such an amazing thing happened here. But you're looking around this, a room like this one, for instance, and somebody can tell you that a great debate happened here, but what are you seeing in this room that is helping you to understand the terms of that debate or the meaning of that debate? So what we are really trying to do is to help people, to use places to help people read the landscape around them, to kind of understand the form and the shape, the architecture of repression and resistance, so that you can sort of, so people can spot it more easily as it's forming in places where it's not labeled in their landscape today. So for instance, if you visit the Gulag Museum, as I mentioned, this is the Stalinist labor camp that's preserved as a museum. I mean, your visit to your experience of the museum begins when you board a bus in the main city of Perm, and you sit on that bus for 4 hours on the road to this site. So and you're sort of getting some interpretation and history on the way. So first, you're really experiencing the fact that this place was in the absolute, so isolated, so removed, and you understand by that people were snatched from their homes and communities and isolated in a really remote place where they would never be found. You arrive, and it's in some ways very much like reading any other form of prison. I mean, prison architecture is about control, and it's about dehumanization and segregation. So you can read the way that this system was trying to control people and dehumanize them through moving through this space. When you're seeing the guard tower, you're seeing the barbed wires, you're seeing the scale of the cells, you're seeing all the inequalities in that. So you're reading this system in this space. A totally other, alternative example, that's sort of the most literal, obvious way, but in Buenos Aires, Memoria Abierta, which means open memory, their project. In the case of Argentina, or in Buenos Aires, the system of state terrorism, people, dissidents or people who were considered dangerous, were kidnapped and tortured and detained in these little sites all throughout the city of Buenos Aires, which is a wonderful, thriving, bustling city. And all these little torture chambers were opened in grocery stores, in schools, in police stations, in all these gas stations, all these little ordinary places, all throughout the city. So what Memoria Abierta has done is is created this program where they've kind of pulled back the veil for people on their own city. So people are touring the city and seeing it in a completely new way because they're identifying all the different places where this atrocity occurred and implicating people, trying to make sure that they never, that they see what happened, and therefore they in the future will insist upon bearing witness to anything that's suspicious or deserves attention in the city now. So this was sort of allowed to happen by the numbers of citizens who sort of walked by those places and heard things or saw things that were not right and didn't speak up and didn't say anything. So that's another way of reading, of using sight and reading a site. So that's the key to our first, to the sort of first criteria of what we're trying to do. The second one about drawing connections between past and present and stimulating dialogue is really the core of our practice, and that's where we're trying to transform the idea of museums from places of passive learning to make them really new forums for engagement and kind of catalysts for civic participation. So for us, the key interaction there is not between the visitor and the exhibit or the visitor and the object, but it's between the visitors, so that the museum becomes a kind of container or a forum and a catalyst for new kinds of connections and debates and interactions among visitors. And that requires a different kind of mode of operating. In examples of how this has worked successfully in the District 6 Museum in South Africa, this is based in a church that is one of the sort of refuges for residents who were expelled from their homes when an entire neighborhood that was a mixed race neighborhood was razed to the ground to make way for a whites only district. So people's homes were bulldozed, they lost everything, and a group of activists covered the floor of a Methodist church with a map of the neighborhood that had been destroyed and invited people who had lost their homes to come and write their memories directly on this map, share their memories with each other, and just sort of reconstruct the life of that neighborhood. And it was in that process of engagement, both with the map, of course, but with each other, that a whole campaign that was called Hands Off District 6, that was designed to prevent the whites-only district from being built, was organized. So it was a major kind of axis of the anti-apartheid movement. After and towards the end and after apartheid, this interaction also generated a land claims movement, a sort of reparations movement, where the people who were gathering around this map came together to stake claims to get title to their land back. And they successfully won title to their land back, and the court, the kind of proceedings of that granted people their land back, was held on the map itself. The seats were placed on the map, and people were granted, actual keys to houses eventually by when they were sitting on the map. So that's an example of a totally different way of thinking about what happens in a museum and what it can lead to and what the form of interaction is. The Liberation War Museum in Bangladesh is another example where they have sponsored an oral history program where they send young people out into their neighborhoods and into their families to ask about the Liberation War and ask about their friends and families and neighbors' role in this struggle, since almost every citizen of the country had some involvement in it. So that forces this conversation and this interaction about a subject that people don't like to talk about. And the child then writes up the oral history in their own words and writes their own response to it, and writes about what that story or that they've learned means for their lives today. And then these oral histories are performed in the space of the museum, bringing together all the different families and relatives and friends, along with the children who have interviewed them. So that's another type of interaction. The third criteria for us that actually was added later in the coalition's development is to share opportunities for public involvement. And this came as a result of a discussion about whether you can stop with dialogue, or whether it's our responsibility to try to sponsor more direct action. And the decision was that it was very important for us to show visitors the possibilities for how they could get involved without prescribing a particular course of action. So the workhouse in England, for instance, has a room at the end, a sort of whole exhibit at the end of their tour called What Now, What Next, that asks a whole set of questions about where people who would have been in the workhouse in 1834, where those categories of people would be today, what the British social welfare system is doing for them today, and then asks whether, is that a better solution, and what should be done, and then has a whole area of all the different kind of organizations and groups in the local area that the workhouse, in which workhouse is located, what they're doing, from government programs to private social service agencies to international things like Oxfam, and has material that helps people find out how they can be involved. So that's one example of the sharing opportunities. That was a struggle for us to think how we could proceed.
So obviously this phrase civic engagement is essential to everything that the coalition does, and especially as these dialogue practices and debates about dialogue practices has evolved. How do you think about that term, civic engagement? What does it look like in practice?
Mm-hmm. We feel like it's very important for anybody who's doing engaging with this kind of work in any way to be really clear about what you mean when you say civic engagement, or any term that you're using, just to be really clear about what you want to say, especially when the term civic engagement right now is being used by so many different people on the left and the right to mean really very, very different things. And in fact, a colleague of ours mentioned to me that in his experience, civic engagement connotes sort of white liberal politics, whereas social justice and social change is associated with more progressive politics led by people of color. This was just his association. I thought that was a very important and interesting problem to be addressed. So for us, we sort of work towards the definition through the building blocks of what we feel composes it. But I first worked with a group of funders and practitioners who were dealing with this term a number of years ago, trying to say sort of like, how would you know civic engagement if you saw it, and how would you evaluate it? It was something about evaluation. So it was that set of ideas that we really kind of brought to our work, that ideas about what it meant to promoting civic engagement meant building relationships among people, engaging diverse people in civic issues, inspiring a sense of civic responsibility, and generally inspiring and equipping people to shape their environment. So that was the set of issues that came out of that conversation. So we sort of went back, and for us, the foundation of civic engagement is dialogue. And that's another term that means many different things to different people. And so for us, it was also important to define what we meant by that, especially defining dialogue as opposed to conversation, debate, discussion, because those all are sort of different, connote different things. So we used definitions that others had created and cobbled together, something defining for us dialogue as a process of sharing perspectives, ideas, experiences for learning, personal growth, and collaborative problem solving. It's a process in which assumptions are brought out into the open, in which people are encouraged to suspend judgment. It's a process that seeks to create equality among all participants, and that voices multiple perspectives and fosters understandings of other people's viewpoints. The main kind of foundation of dialogue is that personal experience is as valuable as sort of intellectual knowledge, that all kinds of knowledge and experience are valued, and that it's a sort of space for multiple perspectives to be respected. So that's dialogue, but you could have a dialogue that fits that definition about, about your family or about almost anything. And for us, it was important that we think about what civic dialogue meant, what a kind of collective issue meant. So we talked about civic dialogue as a public dialogue in which people discuss issues, policies, or decisions of consequence to their lives, communities, and society. So that's saying that it's an open space for people to deal with issues that they share. And again, that engages multiple perspectives on an issue, even conflicting ones, and rather than promoting a single point of view. And that was the civic dialogue definition is one we borrowed from the Animating Democracy Initiative, and we found it to be very helpful. So if civic dialogue is the kind of foundation for us of civic engagement, for us, civic engagement is when diverse people become actively involved in civic dialogue with each other on an issue and then take action, different types of action, to shape that issue individually. So that's sort of the way that we're using it and what we're trying to promote in this museum. In that scenario, dialogue is not an end in and of itself. It's a tool that allows you to achieve a whole variety of ends. And for us, it's just as important to define dialogue in words as it is to define what it actually looks like on the ground. I mean, if you want to have dialogue in your museum, what happens when somebody walks through the door? So as a group, as Sites of Conscience, we try to provide as many different forms of dialogue as possible, since there's so many different types of people and different goals that you might have that you engage with. So for instance, at the Tenement Museum, we have public dialogues. That's where people are walking, they walk into the museum, they don't know, never thought about the word dialogue, they have a tour, and afterwards they're invited to have an hour-long conversation about the issues that the tour raised for them. They don't know each other, they never met, they're going to leave in an hour, and they have a really interesting conversation that happens every day. But we never see them again. But we haven't, so it's a particular kind of engagement. We also do much longer sustained work with our local community, with our geographical community, our neighborhood, through a project called the Lower East Side Community Preservation Project, which brings together leaders from a whole variety of different communities to address through history and historic sites the issues that are really coming up in the neighborhood now. And that's like an ongoing sort of monthly and bi-monthly type of dialogue with the same group of people, so you can really deepen that kind of engagement. And we also work with people who have some particular other kind of stake in the story we're telling, whether they're immigrants who are coming not necessarily from the neighborhood but from all over the city, who are talking with each other about how their experience relates to what the immigrants in the in the past who went through the building went through. Or another example is people who are involved professionally in shaping the issues that we're raising. So, for instance, when we open an exhibit about the garment industry and we're raising the issues of sweatshops in New York, We had a sort of day-long summit with people working in all sectors of the garment industry, most of whom were in conflict with each other, to reflect on the development of the garment industry in the past and develop an actual action plan for a specific issue in the New York City garment industry. So those are totally different types of exchanges, but we're using dialogue as a tool to achieve all of those different kinds of conversations. It's also important for the coalition as a whole to create different models of dialogue that are appropriate for different cultures and political contexts. And actually, the physical space where that dialogue happens is part of that, and is very interesting. The Tenement Museum, everything I described to you just then, is those dialogues are held in what we call a kitchen. We call them kitchen table conversations, and the room is really small. It doesn't seat more than about 12 people, and it's designed as a kitchen, like you're sitting around, because in our sort of frame of reference, the most important conversations happen around the kitchen table. On the other hand, in Los Angeles, the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, which has recently opened out of the Japanese American National Museum, built a 300-seat democracy forum, which is much more modeled on like the idea of a legislative body or a deliberative body like that. And they also have something called the Democracy Laboratory, which, laboratory is another kind of framework that's for smaller kind of study groups. So they're using a kind of American, it's just another history, another kind of framework. In South Africa, in Johannesburg, a new site that's just come to us called Constitution Hill is a fantastic model because they have created this whole kind of multi-dimensional civic space where they've built the actual building of the South African Constitutional Court, which is their highest court in the land, on the site of a former apartheid-era prison, so that all of the decisions that the justices make about social justice today are made kind of in reference to or in conversation with the symbol of the abrogation of justice in the past. And it has this whole big kind of open plaza around between the site and the court that is where these things called lechotlas take place. And lechotla is a model of dialogue, a sort of South African form of, or history of dialogue. That's held outside under a big tree where the sort of town comes together to deal with an issue that's affecting the town. So they sponsor a whole variety of different lechotlas about whatever issue the justices are debating in the court, referencing what how that issue was dealt with in the past under apartheid, and just having these kind of some of them are totally public gatherings, some of them are with school children, some of them with ex-prisoners, but that's their history that they bring to us. So you have a kitchen, you have a forum, you have a lechotla, like they're all. So we try to really work, encourage these dialogue practices, these culturally specific dialogue practices.
Just to footnote something, you referred to the Animating Democracy Initiative, and I don't know if people know about that, but it was mostly Ford Foundation funded multi-year project that focused on that funded projects in which a local arts organization was working with community partners on a burning community issue, or civic issue. And the publications that came out of that, there was a whole strand of that called the Critical Engagement Project, and those books are now out, and I really recommend them to you. It was very powerful.
And the Lower East Side Community Preservation Project is one of the projects in there, so you can read about that. I think there's a little bit about the coalition in there too, so yeah, it was great.
So I want to know what members of the International Coalition argue about when you all get together. I'm looking at the subtopics of the African sites of conscience, the themes of the different regions, and I just can imagine the debates that led to this differentiation. And so can you let us in behind the scenes on that a little bit?
And of course, I see all of these as very productive, creative tensions, but it does get, pretty heated when we get together. As you can imagine, this group of, people who are coming from such a variety of perspectives. I think the the toughest issue is the one that I've been talking most about, which is what dialogue means and what it implies for a human rights campaign. The question really is, should a site of conscience be a forum for debate or a forum for dialogue, or an advocate for a particular justice issue? And are those things mutually exclusive? So, you know, we all agree that our overall goal is to create a lasting culture of human rights, that, you know, the sort of truth commissions and prosecutions and reparations are kind of time limited ways of addressing abuses and moving forward. But those will, the benefits of those will disappear if there isn't a broad, popular embrace, if the citizenry doesn't embrace a culture of human rights and doesn't practice these values on a day-to-day basis. So that's sort of where we start from. So there's one argument that says that a human rights culture depends on and is built by an engaged citizenry. That if you want to build a citizenry that is going to prevent injustice in the future, those people have to be questioning. They have to be always questioning, always debating, always free to to disagree, to deny, to and always kind of actively engaging with each other. And that if you have a space that tells people what's right and what's wrong, that can render them passive, so that they will sort of repeat what's right and what's wrong. But whether they're going to be able to kind of advocate for that if they're accustomed just being told what to do, that sort of undermines the objective. So that camp would make, for them, constant multiple perspectives and dialogue within the space of the museum is critical. There's another side to that, and these are kind of false dichotomies, so all of this can kind of coexist, but there's another train of argument that says, especially for people who are coming out of much more recent traumas, where they're still battling simply to have the truth of what happened be acknowledged. The idea of having multiple perspectives and dialogue implies that the real truth of what happened, were those 30,000 people disappeared or were they not? That's not up for debate. They don't, it's not. If that becomes up for debate, then it becomes this completely morally relative space where anybody can come in and just sort of say anything they want, and everybody's equally valued. And if somebody comes in and says, well, all those people should have been shot because they must have done something wrong, or we need to support our president, then, and that voice is louder than another voice, that it's not going to educate the next generation, that the next generation needs to have a clear understanding of what happened and a clear sense of what is right and what is wrong. So it depends what context you're coming from, but both of these perspectives are incredibly important. And we once had to actually write something that tried to bring some kind of compromise to that, and we wrote that we support and validate the fundamental forensic truths about what happened, while promoting open dialogue on the implications of what happened for the present, for the future. So, I'm sure we could come up with it. I'm not saying that's like the tying it all up, but it's one way where, when forced to for a particular situation, we try to bring those things together. The other debate, and this is kind of related, is about how much the process is of developing a site should be a dialogue process in and of itself, and how much the process is actually the work, the part of the product. And interestingly, there are some sites that, well, I'll set up the debate, and then there's some sites that are kind of on one side of the first debate I said and on another side of the other debate, and you'd think they'd be on the same side, but it's different. So it has to do with whether the District 6 Museum, for instance, is a totally community-built museum. The story is a collective one. The narrative is built by individual people coming in and contributing their memories, and it kind of grows from there. There's very little kind of official narrative. The role of the expert historian is not privileged. Terezin Memorial, on the other hand, has to deal with Holocaust deniers all the time, and it's extremely important that there is an expert historian voice, that the exhibits are not developed in collaboration with a bunch of people who don't know anything, which is in their mind. They're not. It's not a grassroots process. You can have any dialogue and responses you want to their exhibit, they would say, but we build it ourselves to the kind of highest historical standards, and we can't just kind of muddy that with everybody's false memories and muddy, blurry perspectives on things. So whether civic engagement happens from the moment you decide to create the museum, and that the civic engagement is happening in the development of the museum all the way through the kind of opening of it, is a question that people debate a lot. So those are two of the most heated.
Well, not that this is going to be heated, but it's time to open it up to all of you.
I work in Ghana, and some very, very powerful sites of conscience exist in the slave forts along the coast. And the people in Ghana are very much involved in the UNESCO Slave Route Project. One of the things that's going on there right now is there's a tremendous amount of tension between the tourist industry and these sites of conscience. Is this something that your organization is confronting or dealing with in certain locations?
I was just in Ghana like a couple of weeks ago, actually, dealing with trying to bring the tourist industry actually into expanding their interest in sites beyond the slave history to more recent sites of human rights violations through and after independence. But we did observe the tensions between the community and the sites, that there are people who are trying to live and work right around the slave sites, and then all these tourists coming in. There's no provision made for school children to be able to get admission to those sites. So we we just conducted a series of conversations about those issues for them to kind of come out and encourage people to find their own solutions instead. So they're setting up a kind of committee to start working through those with us.
Right, and
if I can just piggyback on that, last summer I spent 3 days in a public cultural institutions workshop in Cape Town, where there were people there from not just from South Africa, but from Zambia and elsewhere in Africa. And that theme of the tension between the heritage and cultural tourism industry and the sites of conscience and history, kind of community history work was intense and pervasive and felt every day by, I'd say, 2/3 of the people in that room, mostly the people who were working in non-academic settings, but to some extent with very engaged academics as well, that in a country with 40% unemployment, the pressure around economic development linked to these cultural heritage sites, it was a daily dialogue and struggle.
The one thing I would say that sometimes was missing in that battle was tourists were never considered sort of citizens with civic obligations of their own, and I think if in that debate the people, wherever they're from, are being brought into the issue that you're wanting to deal with, and understanding that people are coming from a whole variety of different locations in the broadest sense with their own potential for action and obligation, then I think it just kind of opens up the debate a little bit better.
A question that I have regarding advocacy and determining what's right or what's wrong. and thinking, I mean, I'm not suggesting you're at this point yet, but I can see how you move to within political advocacy as well, in determining that, you know, this is a social policy that should be going on, or this is not a social policy that should be continued, and therefore influencing political votes here and there. And something that's happening now, a large debate that's happening, is whether or not churches should lose their nonprofit status as a result of determining which political parties are telling their congregations which political party should be voted for. Is this something that you're thinking about or have considered or created contingencies for?
I'm pretty sure that it's hard because I'm sort of definitely in one space in this debate, but I think I can safely say that that none of the sites feels it's the right thing to do to advocate that specifically for a specific piece of legislation or a specific political candidate. That hasn't come up yet. But you know, there are a lot of gray areas because the District 6 Museum, for example, right now is very involved on one very particular side of a debate about what to do with the bones of some slaves that were discovered. It's a similar thing as we've had in this country, a similar debate. And that is actually a law that they have to, about whether to let this developer do this or that. So they are getting behind that, but it's kind of a heritage issue in a way. So I think we're, you know, people are basically feel that it is about a forum to get people involved and to really air all sides of that. I think it's just a question of what is up for debate and what's not up for debate. I think that's more it. And a lot of, I mean, the other thing is in the Tenement Museum, a lot of the staff, there's a lot of conflict among this. A lot of people come to the Tenement Museum because they have a very particular political, you know, point of view, which I agree with and respect. And on the tours, they want to reach people with it. And so our educator training is often a big tricky thing too, because we sympathize with that, but there's limits that we want to put. So.
In my last trip to your website, I noticed some information that was there about some pushback that you're getting from groups within this country claiming that the coalition is anti-American or un-American. Can you speak a little bit to where that pushback is coming from and what the response of the coalition is?
It was that was the moment I was mentioning where we had to write our sort of thing, but it was very, very specific context, and it was about it in the whole debate about the World Trade Center, and specifically about a proposed institution called the International Freedom Center that was proposed to be built there, which is not the memorial, the World Trade Center Memorial Museum. It's a totally separate institution. It was going to be something called the International Freedom Center, which incidentally started out being called the Museum of American Freedom. And this was an institution or a project that came to the coalition on a number of occasions asking for our input on their ideas. And we were very happy to be asked, and we're all the way through extremely critical of their plans from the point of view of you know, when it was called the Museum of American Freedom. I mean, this is the whole notion of encompassing that whole complex experience in the rubric of freedom. What does freedom mean? Why would it be called American Freedom? They eventually, over the course of our conversations, changed it to the International Freedom Center, and it was a much more international view. So we took minutes of those meetings, and those minutes were public on our website, and they had statements from all of the coalition members saying things like, something called the Museum of American Freedom makes it sound like this was only America's event, or that America is the, you know, has a monopoly on freedom, or America defines freedom for the world. Some other, you know, that it didn't seem that there was any room. How can you have an institution called something about freedom if you don't have any room for debate there? So it was a lot of criticism like that, and a, you know, particular style of newspaper in New York took those quotes and shared them with the families of a portion of the families of the victims. Our chair happens to be from Bangladesh, and that there was something about him being from Bangladesh and us saying things like, we were commenting on like a draft, a 5-year-old draft of their plan. I mean, it was sort of like a weird yellow journalism thing. But the point was that, I mean, really in the end, they were just using any other leverage they could to dump on the Freedom Center because they didn't want the Freedom Center to exist. And in the course of all of this, we got labeled, our emphasis on dialogue and internationalism got labeled anti-American and anti, you know, in our context was also like anti-New York, you know, anti-families, anti-firemen, and just unpatriotic. And we responded, it was one of the dumbest things I ever had to write. It was so disheartening. I mean, you could say what, you just had to respond on the stupidest level. I just said, well, if you're having a space about freedom, you know, if you're going to call it that, we don't agree with calling it that. If you're going to call it that, there has to be some room for debate, and America doesn't have the corner of the market on freedom. So if you're going to have something called the Freedom Center, we were just saying it should be in an international perspective. And you know, that what happened on that day was very complex and affected a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and there should just be a space for dealing with that.
I had a question. I had last summer an opportunity to visit a place called Sand Creek in Colorado, site of the, I think it was 1863 Sand Creek Massacre. And I know that the Cheyenne and the Arapaho people are collaborating with the National Park Service to create a site there, a memorial of some sort. And I was struck again by what you talked about, places of repression and resistance. And I'm wondering, and maybe I didn't catch, or my question is, are there, given the long troubled history of Native Americans in this country, are there any sites involving indigenous peoples in the United States that are one of these sites yet, or as part of your group?
There are a number of sites in a lot of different states in the broader network, and Julie mentioned, but we're not really satisfied with where we are right now with that. And Julie mentioned these 4 regional networks, this framework of regional network. And our next project in the U.S. is to build a Native American Sites of Conscience network, because or sort of project, because we feel that there are really specific issues. I mean, taking everything that we just talked about today and like thinking about that in the context of Native American politics and history, it's a very unique, it's a particular kind of way that those things are going to connect, and I think they'll take different forms and have different implications in that context, and so it's a really important thing for us to do, and that's kind of our next year's big project. We're trying to solicit a very important person for our board who would be helping us do that, and it's something that's very, very important to us.
You alluded to some problems with the Gulag Museum that they're going through
It's
right
not
now.
them, it's another one.
Oh, okay.
But I can, yeah.
Give us an update.
Yeah. I know very little, so definite, but it was disturbing enough. There's a site that was coming in to the network called the Mednoye Memorial, and this was a town about 2 or 3 hours from Moscow that during in the 30s and 40s was a very kind of international town. There were a lot of Polish people there. There were a lot of people from a number of different countries, but particularly a lot of Poles. And there was a scare about towards the end of World War II, about a kind of panic about sedition and foreign spies that led to a NKVD massacre and it was just this horrible process that took place over about 6 months. It was kind of a rapid thing where You know, there was just sort of raids of people's houses and people being dragged off and killed for, you know, suspicion of sedition. And the worst was that the citizens themselves were turning each other in like mad because they were trying to save themselves and pointing the finger at everybody else. So it really corrupted this whole town. Up until, and it's very well documented, and up until very recently, the sort of official history was that this was just this random SS shooting. But there's, you know, everybody left, that the NKVD had actually left a very copious, you know, paper trail about exactly what they were trying to do. And so those were uncovered in the archives by this group. And they developed an exhibit about this repression and about what happened, and memorials to, the site is this mass grave where all of the bodies were just sort of dumped. And they were, you know, they're very interested not just in telling it as a story of an army who came in and sort of destroyed everybody, but about the citizens, the way that citizens kind of turned on themselves, and to ask questions about civic responsibility for protecting each other. But so they have this wonderful exhibit about that, and we heard on February 10th that the Ministry, it is a state-controlled site, and that the Ministry of Culture was planning to either shut it down altogether or remove the exhibits about that repression, which is a story that's like being mirrored very closely today in Russia, where there's this new panic about foreign spies, foreign attacks that has been the kind of underlying impetus behind a law that's suppressing the activities of non-governmental organizations. So we are doing a lot of advocacy work to make sure. We actually had planned a year ago anyway to have our big meeting in Russia. So we just wrote a letter, you know, we're just telling everybody we're so looking forward to going and seeing your great exhibits about what happened, you know, what the NKVD did, and everybody is so interested in learning from it and look forward to seeing it on this date, and it better be there, kind of thing.
So we'd just like to hear from you a little bit about what you talked about in your conversations, and then anybody can comment on each other's. Who would like to go first?
My partner had babysitter obligations, so she had to leave, but she's a history teacher here at the university, and she was primarily interested in history, I guess, in relation to a historical site. But we were talking more about my interests. I'm a student at the School of Information in the Archives program, and I find it very interesting because I didn't know that there were programs dealing with, I guess, the disappeared. And I think it's really relevant because I personally am interested in Latin American collections, and how do we go about making these comprehensive collections when the idea in a lot of these places is that all of the information and the people in the dialogue are gone. So I was very curious how they're working with that, what they're using, and then also how they're interfacing with other more, I guess, traditional institutions like museums and universities and even the government. So I think it's terribly relevant to what I'm doing.
Good. Yeah, that sounds interesting. Well, Memoria Abierta has just opened their very first exhibit that's you know, displaying all of the materials that they've collected, or a good portion of the materials they've collected over time. But they have a great documentation archive, sound archive, photo archive, video archive, and all of that can be, a lot of it can be viewed on their website, actually, so you can see how they do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are there other institutions like this within Latin America or South America?
They're building their own regional network.
Okay.
Via Grimaldi in Chile is the other sort of established institution, and they're not up on our site yet, but they have their own website. But a lot of them are just, there's a Museum of Memory in Rosario, which is a province of Argentina. They have a website too. But Memoria Abierta is building a whole network of just pulling together all the little kind of groups that are trying to struggle to put these together. So there'll be about 30 of them by the end of June.
We're actually, it turned out we're both from Detroit. I'm with the Detroit Historical Museum, and I forgot. Melanie worked at the Wright Museum of African American History. we were talking about some projects that could be done in Detroit, or how do you in a sort of a broadly based museum address issues that are controversial or in some way opposed to what the people would generally think that they were going to see when they came to your institution. So,
yeah, right. What were some of the projects you were thinking about, or some of the issues that you were talking about?
well, actually, I was. I might point out, I was in Baltimore for 20 years at the Baltimore Museum of Industry, and we did a kind of it was called the Kids Cannery Experience. It was a living history program where school groups came in and they worked in a cannery, simulated worked in a cannery, and some of them were shuckers and some of them were printers, and there was a whole hierarchy of skills that illustrated the different aspects of industrial labor, and that was very successful. And I think there was not a sort of conscious point of view to be sort of ideological, I should say, but I think people took away a lot of different things from that experience. And I think that can be done. You don't have to have a museum of conscience to prick people's consciences.
Mm-hmm.
So.
What about at the Wright Museum?
They've tried to connect with the larger communities, but again, I mean, the same problem that you mentioned earlier of what happens. How does the reality of the situation work with decreased funding and problems dealing with funding agencies like the city of Detroit? And when you're sort of beleaguered, how do you do the type of work that you want to do?
It's a lot cheaper than some of the big exhibits that are at the Wright Museum to just have people. I mean, the great thing about this work is that the Kitchen Conversation program at the Tenement Museum costs about 35 cents a person, because we just have a little cookies, and that's about it. So it really, I mean, that's one thing I feel really strongly about, is that we hear that a lot, that to do this would be expensive, and you see the kind of investment that's made into certain types of technology in exhibits, or certain expenses in exhibits that are just like, the scale of it is so much larger than what it costs to invite people into a room, give them some coffee, and have a conversation about what they've just seen. It does not take, resources are not the obstacle.
Well, the Wright Museum just redid its whole core exhibit. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
Because the conversation that they had with their community was that they were tired of the slave ship, and they wanted an exhibit that stressed some of the positive contributions of African Americans in Detroit particularly. And so they did it. I think they still have the ship, but but they have a lot more of the street where all the black entertainment was, Paradise Valley.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I did some work for my dissertation at the Charles Wright Museum, and I basically was interested in the parent-child conversations that happened as families toured around the older exhibit. And I found that because the older exhibit was so sparse and so sort of traditionally presented information, that parents really had to engage their children and really had to talk about issues. And they talked about a variety of things from their own family histories and that sort of thing. And just anecdotally speaking, I haven't done a project. I'm trying to do a follow-up project in the new exhibit. But when I just sort of watch parents and children, I've been there, several times, and the exhibit is so impressive and so awesome that they don't really engage in that same communication, that they sort of experience it on their own as opposed to as a group. And I just believe that conversation is just so important in helping just to process the exhibit as it is, but then also to make a more personalized and more connected response to what's being said. So I'm
Museum
hoping.
community is beating their brains out to create interactive exhibits.
Yeah, sometimes it's just simple.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that we recognize is that dialogue is a totally unnatural process. It does not happen just spontaneously, and it's sort of uncomfortable, and that's why we feel strongly that a museum should create that space for it. Because it's not just going to happen, because none of us do this ordinarily. I mean, it's just.
I saw the lynching photographs exhibit in two places. I saw it at the New York Historical Society, and then a couple of years later when it was in Detroit, I saw it. And I saw it 3 times in Detroit, once with South African visitors, and then once with students, and once just ourselves. But at the New York Historical Society, absolutely, immediately next to the room where you were looking at the photographs, there was a dialogue room, and there were people there, and there was
facilitating.
And there was that day. There was also a conference going on. There were people speaking about it. There was a lot of very visible process around it, and response opportunities, and emotional support opportunities. When I saw it at the Wright Museum, there was a place where you could write responses and stick them on a wall, but there was not a person there. There was not a space where a gathering space. It was you were on your own with that material, pretty much. It's really very dramatic difference.
Today's conversation is really relevant to my future experience, because I will be actually working at the District 6 over the summer.
Oh, great. Oh.
And it's also really interesting. I haven't been to any of the sites of conscience in Russia, and I am from Russia, and there's actually history of repressions in the family. So this is something that I will definitely check out and see if I can contribute in any way, given the experience and background.
Well, we're going to be there from June 25th to July 3rd. So.
Our flight.
All right.
The two of us actually are interested in working in art museums, and so we were really grappling with this, and I guess we came up more with questions for you. Just about how to think about some of these strategies of encouraging dialogue and encouraging engagement in the space of a more traditional museum. If you have any kind of quick ideas about how to do that and how to kind of crack that nut, because certainly art museums are loaded with all kinds of baggage, and this whole notion of being a very elite and very kind of respected space that prohibits dialogue. So I think we were left more with questions than coming to any kind of conclusion.
Well, I would say that there's, again, it's just if you take as your starting point, the idea that you're trying to not foster only interaction between the visitor and the object, but between visitors, and thinking of the objects as the catalyst for engagement between visitors, the objects as the kind of new perspectives that give the people, the observer, something new to think about that they can then engage with somebody else in that space. Then I wouldn't. Obviously, there's a history of not talking and a certain sort of like culture of interaction, but there's no reason why there can't be a space for people. A space for people to engage with each other can't be created in such a museum. So and a space for engaging with the actual architecture of the museum itself, and if you want to go there, and the history of it, and who was on the board, and where they make their money, and all that kind of stuff. But even if you don't do that, there's just no reason there can't be another little room someplace where people can just have a structure for engagement with each other. So I know that it's often harder to think about it in the case of an art museum, but I don't see anything inherent that it's just
we were just at the Newark Museum, which has an amazing American art collection, and they're doing some presentational things which seem to me would be very ripe for dialogue, just the way things are presented.
Yeah. The second, third technically, place to host the witness, or what did they later call Without Sanctuary exhibit, was Andy Warhol Museum. It's an art museum.
Well, I'm an architect by training, so I'm looking at this from a somewhat different perspective. And my interest really has been in the development of cultural centers like museums as part of urban renewal projects. So the question of a contested space is really the site of the city. So it's less, maybe I was saying to Ray about sites of conscience, and maybe more about the decision making, the economics that go into constructing some of these types of buildings, and who are the constituents, you know, who do they talk to when they're deciding what the content is for an art museum? You know, is it tourism driven? So these are sorts of things that I've been dealing with. So it's somewhat different, but certainly there's a lot of overlap and intriguing questions.
I'm working with a community where I, 25 years ago, did my PhD research and helping them develop a cultural center. And the role I've ended up playing is that what has been driving them in the last several years is economics, tapping into, you know, the heritage tourism industry. And what I'm trying to do is engage them in conversations to sort of reorient their thinking about what they're calling a cultural village could mean if it became a cultural center for the community, and that the tourism basically becomes a byproduct of what might be work that is much more vital to the community, and that cultural center becomes an arena for dialogue for the community, first and foremost, a place where tradition, heritage, local tradition and heritage is preserved, where it's celebrated, and where the various ethnic groups, it's a very diverse community, can come together in a relatively neutral political space to do some very important social work in this context of dialogue. And it's been an interesting process for me because I'm trying to stay as much as possible out of the center of the decision making that's going on, and basically stay on the sidelines in terms of just talking with people about what some of their options might be.
Thank you so much, and this has been a great dialogue, and it's been great listening to one another as well, which I know was part of your intent. So we'll get you back to Michigan again, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
This time.